Hello and welcome to the stream. Parson reads from the book of Samuel. More specifically, I am reading 2 Samuel, and I will be starting from chapter 13 today. And this one, I hyped up this reading, like for the last few weeks, because I guess I'll do my preface before we do a quick word of prayer, but I really am quite excited to do this one because in a way these set of chapters, it really inspired why I wanted to do a reading of the book of Samuel. And it was one of those things where this is just one of the most relevant passages to read, I think. With that said, we will dive into the content, but that is kind of how I'm hyping this part of, 2 Samuel up by saying this is one of the most interesting set of chapters because I think it's some of the most relevant set of chapters. I mean, there's more. I kind of have to divide this into two parts because there's just so much content. I will talk quite a bit about chapter 13 in a great amount of detail, and then of course chapter 17 when we get to it. But I'm gonna hold off on doing that and put them as two separate streams because there's just so much I want to talk about in those two chapters, 13 specifically and 17 as well, when we get there. And so even though from chapter 13 to chapter 20 ish, it's really one big story, but there was no way I was going to fit that in one stream. There'd be no way I could fit chapter 13 and chapter 20 in one stream and do it justice. So we're going to divide this up into two streams. And that's kind of the plan. So with that said, let's just, turn your Bibles to 2 Samuel 13. Give you guys a minute to do so. I will be using the New International Version, or NIV for short. And I will start us off with a quick word of prayer, and then we will dive into the insanity that is 2 Samuel 13. And you're in for a doozy on this one. But let's just bow our heads quickly, and then we will begin. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And as we read your word and delve into the craziness that people had to go through, Lord, I just pray that you would allow this to reflect into all of our hearts and the weight of responsibility that we have to not just you, but to one another as well as people. And Lord, I just pray that you would reveal that to us in this story. I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. All right, so just a quick review, if you will, of the last couple of chapters, because I know I missed last week's reading because I was part of a 24-hour stream. Not my own, obviously. No way you wouldn't catch me dead doing a 24-hour stream. But I was part of someone else's for various parts of it, and that's why I didn't do a reading stream last week. So 2 weeks ago when I last read, we had gone over some of the shifty stuff that David was doing, right? David, he commits adultery with Bathsheba, one of the most ironically named characters, and David tries to cover it up by having her husband killed. Well, he tries to cover it up first by having Bathsheba's husband Uriah have sex with his wife and then just pass off the child as his, even though that was a plan that clearly would not work for obvious reasons, as I pointed out in that stream. But then when David's first plan doesn't work, he decides to have Uriah murdered. Now David thinks that he's being real sly and he's being, a real genius behind this. And of course I also pointed out that there was another problem aside from David trying to be very conniving. He's also an abuser of power, which is interesting that it brings up to one of my favorite parts of the Bible is when the prophet Nathan confronts him. And Nathan basically is just who do you think you are, right? You know, the only reason why you're king is because God said so, and God can easily remove you. So don't forget that. And then, you know, David, he cries for forgiveness, and while Nathan says God will forgive you, there's still going to be hell to pay, and so your son will die. And then that's what happens. And then, of course, time passes, and David has another child with Bathsheba, and that is the birth of Solomon. Of course, Solomon will be an important character later on. But for now, as we move into chapter 13, Solomon will be put to the side. He's kind of not important for the next while. Because, once again, the Bible goes back to the primary theme of the book of Samuel. As I've said many a times, and I will say it again, the primary theme of the book of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, is the idea that only God can be king, because when human beings are given that power, things will go wrong very quickly. We saw this with Saul. Saul was an abuser of power, thought he could do whatever he wanted, and God was not happy with that. And then now David also did that, right? He kind of just did whatever he wanted. And that obviously led to bad things. Of course, you know, it's not merely the abuse of power, but with that comes other problems, right, in a person's moral character. And so, you know, both with Saul, not well, Saul, it wasn't as obvious. They didn't point it out as much with Saul, but with David, it was definitely pointed out that, like, you know, these guys obviously had couldn't keep their plungers in their pants, right? You know, having all these multiple wives and stuff, and you know, every guy thinks it's amazing to have a harem, but in the grand scheme of things, it actually really sucks because there are all kinds of problems. First of all, what what rational man wants to have multiple women yelling at him all the time? So there's that. But then, you know, you'll run into the problem that we run into in chapter 13. And that is when you have all these women, you're also going to have all these kids. And what do you do with that, right? And of course, with David's case of abusing power, and a large portion of that is that basically, a way of putting it is that David is basically a giant teenager, right? And he's never moved out of that despite being king for quite a while now. He's never stopped being an immature teenager. You know, it's one of those things where, like, we can kind of let it go, you know, when a teenager is being immature when they're teenagers, because that's kind of the rule of thumb. Teenagers are just immature little, you know, little shits, right? That's the life of a teenager. When you're a teenager and you do that, people are just, you know, people will be pretty forgiving and like, yeah, whatever, you're a teenager, right? Whatever. But if you were like my age, and for, you know, reference, if you watch my Throwback Thursday videos of Heroes by Magic, you get a good idea of how old I am. You know, if you're acting like a teenager at my age, you know, people aren't going to be so thrilled about you, right? As a matter of fact, you can have a lot of negative consequences, right? Easily. You know, getting fired from your job is one of them, right? Potential dating prospects will quickly go down the toilet if you act like a teenager. You know, when you're older, right? In King David's case, it's gonna be that bad. It's gonna be bad, right? And it's one of those things. What happens when you don't grow up? And one of those things that, you know, you have to grow up and deal with, especially when you're, you know, philandering around with all these women, is you got to deal with all these kids. And we're going to quickly see that we have another thing to add to David's sin counter, right? That, you know, he's if you've been keeping track and writing notes, you know, I've already mentioned David's a little bit too bloodthirsty, right? He's also, you know, a philanderer and can't keep his plunger in his pants. And now we're going to add bad parenting to his list of sins. So that's where we're going to dive right into today, talking about, you know, more of David's character flaws, which just reinforces the idea that human beings can't be king, right? Only God can do that, because human beings will abuse power, and then, of course, all these other things will go wrong. With that said, though, let us dive right into chapter 13. Because boy howdy, warning, you're in for a wild ride. Also, I might as well say this now. This is your official warning that we are moving into some very sensitive topics here. More hot takes than the average hot take week. But we are moving into some adult subject matter. So, here's your warning. It's kind of funny, doing a Bible reading stream, and I have to mention the fact I should probably have made a graphic of this, that this is rated R. So, you've been warned. So, chapter 13. In the course of time, Amnon, the son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, the son of David. Now Amnon became so obsessed with his sister Tamar that he made himself ill. She was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her. Now Amnon had an advisor named Jonadab, the son of Shemiah, David's brother. Now Jonadab was a very shrewd man, and he asked Amnon, "Why do you, the king's son, look so haggard, morning after morning? Won't you tell me?" And Amnon said to him, "I fell in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." "Now go to bed and pretend to be ill," Jonadab said. "When your father comes to see you, say to him, 'I would like my sister Tamar to give me something to eat. Let her prepare the food in my sight, so that I may watch her, and then eat it from her hand.'" So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. When the king came to see him, Amnon said to him, "I would like my sister Tamar to come and make some special bread in my sight, so I may eat from her hand." So David sent word to Tamar at the palace. Go to the house of your brother Amnon and prepare some food for him." So Tamar went to the house of her brother Amnon, who was lying down. She took some dough and kneaded it and made the bread in his sight and baked it. Then she took the pan and served the bread, but he refused to eat. "Send everyone out of here. Send everyone out of here," Amnon said. So everyone left. Then Amnon said to... Sorry, I don't know why I was doing the list voice already. I'm still narrating. Then Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food into my bedroom, so I may eat from your hand." So Tamar took the bread she prepared and had brought it to her brother Amnon in his bedroom. But when she took it to him to eat, he grabbed her and said, "Come to bed with me, my sister." "No, my brother," she said to him. "Don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing." "What about me? Where could I go to get rid of my disgrace? And what about you? You would be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. Oh, please speak to the king. He will not keep me from being married to you." But Amnon refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than her, he raped her. Then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he loved her. And Amnon said to her, "Get up and get out." "Oh no," she said to him. "Sending me away would be a greater wrong than what you've already done to me." But Amnon refused to listen to her. He called his personal servant and said, "Get this woman out of my sight and bolt the door after her." So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. Now she was wearing an ornate robe, for this was the kind of garment the virgin daughters of the king wore. Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the ornate robe she was wearing. She put her hands on her head and went away, weeping aloud as she went. Now, Tamar's brother Absalom said to her, I need a voice for this guy. Sorry, I had a brain fart there. I was like, I need a cool voice for this guy. Has that Amnon, your brother, been with you? Be quiet now, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart. And Tamar lived in her brother Absalom's house, a desolate woman. When King David heard all this, he was furious. And Absalom never said a word to Amnon, neither good nor bad. But he hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister Tamar. Okay, I'm going to stop there because there's already a lot there to unpack, right? And chapter 13 is pretty long, so I want to split it into 2 parts. Now, the story is really out there. It's a very sad, sad story, especially, for Tamar. And so, we've entered this super sensitive talking subject matter, where Amnon rapes Tamar, right? He has his way with her. Amnon is clearly painted to be this pretty awful guy, right? That's why I had to give him the list, right? Because he's one of those mustache-twirling villains, right? And, it's one of those weird things. There's a lot of other things that are underlying this, aside from, like, Amnon is an evil person, which he is, right? And we're going to talk about some of the stuff here. So the first thing is I want to point out about this chapter is how screwed up this family is. Let's be real. This family's really screwed up right from the get-go. And, I'm going to add this to, like, many of David's, character flaws and sins of, let's be real, he's actually a pretty terrible dad. We give Saul a lot of crap for, like, hating David, right? But I can give Saul a point in something, and that Saul is not the worst dad in Bible history. He's actually a pretty good dad, right? And, you could justify, to an extent, Saul's hatred of David, right? We wouldn't justify when it becomes an obsession for him, but you can see why Saul would feel really threatened and not like David, especially after being told that, oh, David will be the one who succeeds, succeeds you and takes your throne, right? Because part of it would be that Saul would have wanted his son Jonathan to naturally become king, right? Of course, Jonathan is a very different kind of person. Jonathan wants to obey God more than his own, than himself or his own father. And so Jonathan is willing to give that up. He's willing to give up the crown for his friend David because he believes God. But, ignoring Jonathan for a second, or that part of Jonathan's character, Saul is a pretty good dad in that regard. He wants what's best for his son. He wants his son to be powerful. He wants his son to be a leader, right? Like he is, right? And so, and there's other moments where, like, Saul's interested in what his kids care about, right? Of course, this does get overshadowed by the fact that he becomes so obsessed with David that he starts becoming a bad dad because he forgets to care about what his children actually want. So Saul does kind of slip, he slips in that regard, and he goes from good dad to bad dad. David, on the other hand, though, David is clearly a bad dad from the get-go, right? We hear very little about his concern of, like, his kids. I mean, yeah, there was the whole thing about the unnamed son that dies, but that's more of, like, David doesn't want to be punished by God. He doesn't want to feel that, wrathful vengeance from God, right? But of course, David has to, and God is teaching him a lesson with it, right? So there's that. But other than the unnamed child, we don't see much of David's parentage, right? We just know that he has a whole bunch of kids, but we really see nothing about David being a parent. But based on what we do have in Scripture, we can kind of see David's actually a pretty terrible dad. And that's first of all this whole thing with Amnon, right? Like, but why is we could argue that Amnon is an adult and he doesn't want to live in his dad's house, but then again, if your dad is the king and lives in a palace, why would you want to move out, right? So, but clearly Amnon doesn't live at home. Well, apparently none of the princes do, and there's obviously other reasons behind that, right? Because in the ancient world, and this even carried on in medieval times, you kind of see this where like a prince would have his own castle, right, and have his own place to practice ruling authority, as like princes naturally become vassals of the king. And that could have been the case here with Amnon. Now, obviously, Amnon has his own set of servants and all that. But what we see is that David and his kids have very little connection to each other. Very little connection. And so basically, David didn't raise any of his kids together. Part of that might be because, like, obviously it'd be awkward that, like, you may be siblings, but you all have different moms, right? Because the fact of the matter is your dad is a philanderer. So that'd be kind of awkward. But clearly, none of these siblings know each other very well, let alone like each other. And then there's, this part in the early part of the chapter that's kind of like a throwaway sentence, but it really shows you how screwed up this family is. Is that technically, I guess you could say Absalom and Amnon's cousin, that would be his relation, Jonadab, he's kind of messed up too, right? He's a crappy cousin, to be blunt. And, when Amnon's like, talk about how like, oh man, like, I'm in love with my sister, right? His cousin doesn't call him out for like, you incestuous freak, right? His cousin doesn't call him out for that, as he should, right? As any normal family member would, right? At least that's how we think as like, moderns in the 21st century. That's messed up, right? Like, this is almost Jerry Springer levels of messed up, right? So, there's this whole thing that like Amnon's in love with his sister. And of course, there's the whole, and this is part of ancient world problems, and I know some people are going to give that whole like, oh, see, the Bible's so backward in its thinking, whatever. And the whole like gender segregation, see, it's bad for your society, blah, 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 right? And, there's merit to that argument. Especially where like, the princes don't, associate with the princesses, right? With their own sisters, right? And so, Amnon he clearly doesn't really view her as a sister, right? She's not family in that sense, right? They're only family because like David is their father and no other reason, right? And so, and then Jonadab is like cool with this, right? Like he doesn't call his cousin out for like how disgusting this actually is if you think about it hard enough, right? I mean, this is almost Game of Thrones level bad, right? I mean, it basically is Game of Thrones. I mean, you could argue that Martin obviously used some of this kind of stuff for inspiration, and I mean, not just like the Bible wasn't the only place where you found this to be a problem, this kind of incestuous, funky business going on. But here we go, right? Here we have with Amnon, and he wants to get with his sister. So then him and Jonadab come up with this brilliant plan for them to be alone, and then like basically Amnon's gonna take advantage of that and have his way with her, right? Which he does, right? Now moving on, another observation to talk about here, because I know somebody would probably bring this up, and a lot of people who like, talk about and critique the Bible, they talk about there's this interesting scene where like Tamar even like, she tries to worm her way out is what she does, and she even like suggests that they get married, even though that would have been wrong. And so like, what's up? I mean, this just shows how messed up. People may think that that just makes the family even more messed up, that she'd be okay marrying her brother. Although I disagree with that statement, right? Because Tamar obviously wasn't okay with this. And it wasn't even okay with the idea of marrying him. But in this scene where in um, verse 14, or sorry, verse 13. Verse 13, Tamar tries to plead with Amnon, and she says, like, oh, why don't you just ask our father for my hand in marriage? He obviously wouldn't withhold me from you because you're his son, right? And obviously, patriarchal culture, right? But, the boys do get priority over the girls' demands. But in actuality, when you read the situation here, I think Tamar's just trying to she's just desperate to get herself out of the situation. And to be fair, what woman wouldn't want to get out of the situation, right? I mean, no woman wants to be raped, I'm pretty sure, right? So, you know, Tamar is just using whatever means she can to get herself out of the situation. Of course, to no avail, unfortunately. That's kind of how terrible it is, this scene. But I just wanted to clarify that scene when Tamar says that, and I don't want people to be confused of, like, was she okay with it? Was she willing to actually marry him or whatever? It's like, no, not really. She just wanted to worm her way out. Because literally anything is better. And you're not wrong. Literally anything is better than to be raped, right? That's why Tamar tries to make this plea. But this just shows how much more of an asshole Amnon is, right? That he basically has no regard for her whatsoever. He has absolutely no regard. And he's like, nope, don't care. I'm gonna have my way with you. It's basically, what Amnon does. Now, of course, the Bible does something really interesting here, and part of it is a language thing, but I don't think it's just a mere language thing. So the next part, I know I'm jumping a little bit through the story a bit, but we get to the part where after Amnon has his way with Tamar, and the Bible then states that he hated her more than he loved her. Of course, the obvious thing to point out is that, well, obviously that wasn't real love then. Obviously he didn't love her. And, we know for a fact that when the Bible even refers to it the first time that Amnon loved his sister, what the Bible clearly meant is that he had a lust for her. Of course, there's a few things to unpack with this little notion here. But first I'm going to talk about the linguistical thing, right? So they obviously did have words for stuff like lusting, right? To be fair, the Hebrews had these kind of words for years. But it's interesting. I mean, we can read back in, like, the book of Leviticus, right? And of course there's things about, like, the dangers of lusting. But it's interesting that the Bible doesn't use it here. But what I think is going on here, and this is more like how we interpret things, and part of this is like trying to understand the writer's thinking when he wrote it this way. Trying to think of how the writer was thinking to process this idea. So the writer stuck with using the word love, but we know for a fact that it's more like Amnon lusted for her, right? But after he has his way with her, there's this idea that he's so disgusted with her that even his, like, sexual fantasies are no longer, like, it was already bad enough that he was dehumanizing her by lusting after her, but he goes so far of, like, he's not just dehumanizing her by lusting after her, but he basically, like, views her as less than garbage because he's grown this hatred for her, right? And there's this interesting idea that I think the Bible writer is getting at. And of course, take this with a grain of salt, because I'm going to parallel this with a very modern view of, unfortunately, like, human trafficking, right? And it's more than just a depersonalizing of like viewing women as sex objects, but rather this idea that like beyond a I hate using this kind of wording, but you know, I don't want to feed into like the 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 woke fires, but I'm gonna have to throw some wood in, right? But you know, this idea that like men, and generally it is true that it's men that do this way more often than women do. So when I say men, I do generally mean like men specifically, because they do this a lot more than women do, um, if not almost all of it. Um, it's a primarily man problem, right? But basically, this idea that like women are not just like sex objects, that these guys are, you know, that tends to go through bad men's minds, if you will. And even for, you know, this is why it's kind of a touchy thing to talk about it like this, right? Because you can argue this on like all kinds of levels of different kinds of men, right? But I'm gonna just talk about, you know, more extreme cases where it's not just men devaluing women to a level of like sex objects, but like men project onto women what they can, you know, their power and their authority, right? And you know, that's essentially the idea of where rape comes from, essentially, right? Is the idea that a man can do whatever he wants to a woman, and that, you know, and more often than not, violently, right? And so when we're reading here that like this idea that Amnon's disgust for her was more than even his lust, that was kind of the mindset that Amnon has, right? Of course, you know, when we look at these kind of situations in the modern era, right, and stuff like Me Too, when that was a thing, you know, all these campaigns fighting against, you know, violence against women, you know, as we should fight against those things, right? Because there's a lot of bad men out there that do exactly this, right? They have this disgust for women, you know, the real misogyny, right? Real misogyny of men only viewing women, not just, even worse than sex objects, but like there are people out there that view women merely as the objects of their force, right? And we call these guys, you know, the absolute lowest of the low. And so that's kind of the person Amnon is in this story. I mean, minus the fact that he does have, you know, he has his way with her, you know, despite all her pleas for him to stop. And then his view of her, like his disgust of her, you know, the Bible's painting this portrait of these kind of people, and that Amnon is one such person. Of course, on the one hand, we can say that like, yeah, that's more like an Amnon personal problem, but there's also that kind of, you have, if you read in the context of like David kind of did something similar, right? Though not to this extreme, right? Where David dehumanizes people, and that would be in the case of Uriah, right? And why David felt like he could just kill off Uriah when his plan to pass off his own kid as Uriah's son wouldn't work, right? And so David already dehumanizes people, and so as the old saying goes, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and so Amnon takes that, you know, logical conclusion to like you know, an extreme end. And you know, Amnon, and of course, you know, that just adds on to how terrible like Amnon is. So if he wasn't already a terrible human being for raping a woman, he's just even worse because he's fraudulent. He's fraudulent about how he dehumanizes people, right? And so Amnon is like the worst of worst human beings. That's kind of the whole point of the story. He's the worst of worst human beings. Which then leads up to something the main thing I want to talk about. I know, right? I already talked so much about Amnon and how terrible of a person he is. But he's not even the main subject matter of what I want to talk about. Because this story arc, Amnon is here as a plot device as well to kind of introduce us to another character. And this character, I think, is one of the most interesting, fascinating characters to study. And that person is Absalom. Now, Absalom is another son of David. He's Tamar's brother. And I think he's a great person to study. Not a great person to emulate, but he's a great person to study. Now, I'm going to throw this as the beginning of my thesis. And you will see quickly what I'm talking about as we read the next part of the second half of chapter 13. Because, of course, Absalom takes the spotlight and he's kind of the main character for the next, 6 chapters. Absalom, in my mind, is one of the most important people to study. And the reason I say this, not just hot take of the week, but hot take of, the entire readings of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And I will tell you guys outright about this. Reading this part about Absalom when I was reading, a devotional, way back, actually. Absalom inspired why I wanted to read 1st and 2nd Samuel on stream. And I kind of wish and this is where I even contemplated of reading the book of Samuel during the presidential election. I wanted to really do that. But then, of course, I was already reading Exodus, and I was already, more than waist deep in Exodus, so I didn't want to, cut off, partway through Exodus and then jump around, right? And then, of course, I still wanted to read Judges as well. But in actuality, I did want to read the book of Samuel during the presidential election. And the funny thing was, Absalom is actually what inspired me to do this, reading his character. And the reason for this is because Absalom, he is, it's a scary way to think this, but I think I'm introspective enough to be honest about this. Not to brag, but I mean, it's not something to brag about. So on the other hand, it's right? But I think Absalom is the perfect reflection of my generation. The younger generation, especially the millennials, and moving on and bleeding into Gen Z, right? I think Absalom is the perfect reflection of our generation. And because of that, I think he's the most interesting person to study. I really want you guys to pay attention to. That's why I really hyped up this stream, and I wanted to really do this study with you. Because I think Absalom is the perfect reflection of our generation. Because I'm not going to give it all away now, because you'll read, as we read along, Absalom will be very relatable. And, there will be some of you that, you might feel guilty that you relate to this guy so much, because the truth is, Absalom is not that great a person either. But because of how Absalom behaves in context with, his own father, King David, and then reading that within the whole context of the book of Samuel, it really nails home that point of only God can be king, right? Because what happens when you have human beings try to be God and try to be king, right? Bad things happen. And Absalom is the perfect reflection of our generation, if you will. I assume most of us here that are most of you watching this are closer to my age or younger than me. And this applies to people younger than me as well. That Absalom is the perfect reflection of our generation. And that it's a scary thought when we read some of the stuff he does, but at the same time, there's a perfect logic to it, and a perfectly good logic to it. And because of that, because of how relatable Absalom can be, I think it should force us to be a lot more introspective on what kind of impact that you and I want to leave in this world, right? As we live in the crazy climate that we live in. And, as I mentioned, the presidential campaigns back in 2020, last week to think, back in 2020, I mean, we're already more than halfway through 2021, but this idea of all the more reason we need God and specifically Jesus Christ to, be the one that we devote our lives to, as opposed to trying to put it our devotion into ourselves or into another human being. Because those are, that's basically going to be a dead end, as we will read with Absalom. And I think, I say this now because I want you to really pay attention to this story and the Absalom story, because that's basically what it's going to be now, right? We're in the Absalom story, and Amnon was used as the backdrop and the preface, if you will, of the Absalom story. So Absalom is introduced in the end of this part, so halfway through chapter 13. And of course, Absalom's an interesting character. But I'm going to talk more about what Absalom does here after I read the rest of chapter 13, because of course it'll all make sense. With that said, let us continue on the second half of chapter 13. Can you already believe it's already been like 40 minutes I've been doing this, and I'm only talking about half of a chapter? That's how you know there's like so much to say about this, right? But that's I want to do this part justice, because I think these chapters are really, really important to read and study. After everything I just said about like Absalom being like the most important person to study. All right, so I'm starting in verse 23 of chapter 13. So here we go. 2 years later, when Absalom's sheep shearers were at Baal-hazor near the border of Ephraim, he invited all the king's sons to come there. Absalom went to the king and said, "Your servant has had shearers come. Will the king and his attendants join me?" Oh, sorry, I didn't even do Absalom's voice right. I need a better voice for him. But I'll worry about that in his next dialogue. "No, my son," the king replied. "All of us should not go. We would only be a burden to you." Although Absalom urged him, he still refused to go, but gave him his blessing. Then Absalom said, "If not, please let my brother Amnon come with us." That's the voice I'm going to give him. And the king asked, "Why should he go with you?" But Absalom urged him, so he sent him Amnon and the rest of the king's sons. Verse 28. Now Absalom ordered his men, "Listen up, guys. When Amnon is high in spirits and drinking wine, and I say to you, strike Amnon down. Kill him. Don't be afraid. Haven't I given you this order? Be strong and be brave." So Absalom's men did to Amnon what Absalom had ordered. Then all the king's sons got up, mounted their mules, and fled. Now while they were on their way, the report came to David, "Absalom has struck down all the king's sons, and not one of them is left." The king stood up, tore his clothes, and lay down on the ground. And all of his attendants stood by with their clothes torn. But Jonadab, the son of Shemaiah, David's brother, said, "No, crap, I had a voice for this guy. Oh yeah. My lord should not think that they killed all the princes. Only Amnon is dead. This has been Absalom's express intention ever since the day Amnon raped his sister Tamar. My lord the king should not be concerned about the report that all the king's sons are dead, for only Amnon is dead." Meanwhile, Absalom fled. Now the man standing watch looked up and saw many people on the road west of him, coming down the side of the hill. The watchman went and told the king, "I see men in the direction of Horonaim, on the side of the hill." Jonadab said to the king, "See, the king's sons have come. It had happened just as your servant said." As he finished speaking, the king's sons came in, wailing loudly. The king, too, and all his attendants, wept very bitterly. Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur. But King David mourned many days for his son. After Absalom fled and went to Geshur, he stayed there for 3 years, and King David longed to go to Absalom, for he was consoled concerning Amnon's death. So that's chapter 13. The whole, the rest of it anyway. Now, let's be real here. Real talk here, On the one hand, Absalom's kind of like, oh, killing people already. Not exactly the greatest way to start your story. But at the same time, it's easy to justify his actions, right? Because the Bible just flat out says, well, he did what he did to Amnon because of, this terrible crime against Tamar. Now, of course, this is where I gave that whole hot take that, like, Amnon is like the perfect reflection of my generation. Now, there are a bunch of other things to read in between the lines, right? So, first of all, the beginning of verse 13, the beginning of verse 23 begins with 2 years. 2 years later, right? This event happens. First of all, where's David, right? Now, sure, the end of the last part there talk about how David was furious with Amnon, but he does nothing, right? He doesn't do anything about this serious crime against his own daughter, right? David does nothing. And if I were to when I already made the connection of like Absalom reflects my generation, you could say that David would be the reflection of like my parents' generation and the older generation, the boomers, if you will, right? And this complacency that David has is something that appears in the older generation. And this is where a lot of young people complain about the older generation, right? When it comes to all kinds of different political things, right? Employment problems in, America and in Canada, especially among young people. There's an employment problem. And a lot of that blame is part of the complacency of the older generation. One, not training the younger generation. And two, a bunch of these older people not willing to give younger people opportunity, right? A lot of that feels like it's been stolen away. And so the older generation didn't prepare the younger generation, much like how David did not prepare his children how to live. Then you have things like, a serious crime has happened, right? Well, you think of like how a lot of older generation, and unfortunately you see this even in like the church as well. The older generation, you don't see them as being as proactive against fighting for like social issues, right? And this is true in both inside and outside the church. So I'm not just giving Christians a hard time. It's a general societal problem where the older generation generally does not have as much concern with like social issues, right? Whether it's about women and women's rights, right? Or if it's about things like, we're moving into, it's funny. I'm going to bring this up, some hot takes and controversial talking points. But hey, I'm the streaming Parson, and I think it's more important to talk about what is the case as opposed to trying to play safe, if you will. Because I care about, your guys' intellectual honesty about these kind of things. But you think of like back what was it, like the beginning of July, and sure I did a whole thing because part of it is like I'm under the belief that like, look man, you can't change the past, right? And you can't feel guilty about the past. So while many people were all like, "Oh, how terrible Canada is! It's built on genocide. We can't celebrate Canada Day." It's like I'm gonna do a Canada Day stream anyway because you think like I can't be held back by that, right? I won't let myself be held back by like, oh, Christians did bad things in the past. Well, lots of people do lots of bad things in the past, right? That's just the way it is. And then that was Canada Day. Now this weekend we have BC Day, right? Which I'm sure that'll come up again. I'm sure, I'm gonna normally BC Day, just like Canada Day, would be like a stat holiday, which means we get a day off and all that. Of course, for me, I'd just be streaming Mario and Rabbids like I normally do, but that's besides the point. But on this BC weekend, right? I'm sure there's gonna be people who like boycott. Oh, you shouldn't celebrate BC Day because like BC, just like the rest, as part of Canada, was part of this whole like genocide agenda against the Native Canadians or whatever. And I guess in BC's case, you would say like Salish genocide, right? And so there's gonna be people who give that yammer, right? But it's one of those things where like the older generation doesn't address these kind of issues as much, right? Like these kind of issues, my parents' generation don't talk about these kind of things. I hate to say it this way, but like for the most part, they don't care, right? I know that sounds like a really harsh way of putting it, but that's kind of that's how, especially my generation, we view our parents' generation in regards to stuff like this. Just using this as an example, right? The Indigenous Lives Matter thing, because in regard to the whole thing that's been happening in like June and July, right? And going to former residential schools and finding graveyards or murder scenes or whatever you want to call them. And you don't see the older generation talking as much, right? It's always the younger generation who's always like, "Oh, see how terrible the past, blah 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 blah." Right? Of course, with my more ambivalent attitude, I'm not saying that I promote those things, obviously, but at the same time, it's like, you can't just shame people because of the past, right? What are you doing now about it, right? Are you fighting for people's rights now? That's what you should be doing, not dwelling on things people long dead did, right? Because that's the other funny thing too. It's like, oh, but the survivors of residential schools are some are still around today, and they're really in their senior years, but their perpetrators are basically dead now, right? You can't judge the dead, right? So there's that, right? What are you gonna do? Throw a corpse in prison? What sort of logic is that? But anyway, um, going back with like Absalom and David, contrasting them and then comparing them with our own generations in the 21st century, you see this kind of thing where David is complacent, right, with this serious crime, right, against Tamar, but Absalom, he's like, no, I'm gonna have my revenge, right, and in a in a scary twist, like that's something really relatable. And anyone in my generation, most people in my generation would say like, yeah, like take revenge on rapist as you should, right? And anyone who doesn't have those thoughts is a liar, right? All rapists should be put to death, right? Um, and anyone who's intellectually honest would believe that, right? Because that, as we read earlier in chapter 13, I mean, that was another reason why Tamar was all like, don't throw me out of this house. It would be a worse act than you already did. What could possibly be worse, right? But, there is that old saying, there are fates worse than death, right? And I'm sure, I've met rape victims, and they would say like, yeah, like when a guy doesn't kill you and basically leaves you on the street kind of thing to die, but doesn't just flat out kill you, that they kind of leave you in a fate worse than death. And it is and when you think about stuff like that, it's truly disgusting, and it does raise up that ire in you that's like, I'm going to find these rapists and put them to death, right? um And that's kind of what Amnon does, right? That he does with Amnon. What Absalom does to Amnon, right? Because Absalom's like, I will have my revenge, for the sake of Tamar. And because of that, the dark twist is that, that's a very relatable thing. And, if we're honest about it, like we all think similarly to Absalom here. And it's interesting because, like, when you read the beginning of Absalom's story, and in a funny twist, just like David and just like Saul, these guys start out, like, yeah, they're not bad guys. Like, sure, Absalom takes an extreme measure, but I wouldn't say he's a bad guy, right? I mean, he's doing this for his sister's honor, right? After she's been disgraced, to the degree that she has been, and you know, Absalom is fighting for that, right? Like, as we should fight for justice in the world today, right? Because there's a lot of women who go through the kinds of things Tamar does, and you know, we think that the world needs more Absaloms to take revenge. But wait, you know, it's not that simple. And that's where, we have to keep reading Absalom's story. But what I wanted to really talk about with Absalom in chapter 13 anyway, is that, like, because he's so relatable in that regard, and I say this on a personal level, but I'm also going to say it on a societal level, and I will call you out if you're going to try and say, no, man, I disagree with you. I don't think Absalom's relatable. I don't think like that. I'm going to call you out, because I'm pretty sure that's just you trying to not look as terrible as the rest of us, and trying to think you're on a moral high ground. And of course, part of why I feel confident in being able to call people out if they do try and say something like that is that, like, hey man, I'm Mr. Pastor here, and I think that, right? Because I'm not immune to that, right? But because I'm not so naive to think I am, I can quickly repent of that too, right? And so, but of course, once again, it's all about, when we confess our sins, we must be honest that we are sinners. So, you know, part of that is being honest with the fact that we do have these darker thoughts. And relating with Absalom is one of them. But at the same time, I think it's something we all go through, and it's something we all must go through in some dimension or another. Is that, like, that's Absalom is a very realistic person, right? And I think that's something that, once again, when we're talking about, like, how important it is to read the Bible, because the Bible does understand how you feel, right? God understands you. God understands how you feel. And using even the bad characters, like Absalom, I might as well spoil it. He's a bad guy. Which then is a real kicker to, like, we all relate to a bad guy. But at the same time, yeah, he's a bad guy, but he's a very realistic bad guy. He's not some mustache fictional, he's not a mustache twirling fiction supervillain, right? He's a bad guy, but he's very realistic, and his motivations are like, yeah, I get that, right? Because of course Absalom is he's a bad guy because of the whole theme of the book of Samuel. Only God can be king, and Absalom thinks, no, 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 I can be king, and I can do better than my dad, and even better than God, which is not a good thing to think, but that's what Absalom ends up thinking, and that's his downfall. But with that being said, though, this we read this moment here before he thinks that. He seems like a very, like, yeah, I get this guy. He's relatable, and if you were in his shoes, right? If like someone you loved, went through something like Tamar did, you would act the same way as Absalom, and that's something we should all be honest with, right? I think about that too. It's like, well, if someone I loved went through, was raped, I would want vengeance in the way Absalom does too, and his reaction is very human. It's very honest, I think, and it's something we all need to be honest about. But at the same time, this is where we teeter-totter on the important things, right? And once again, back to the main theme of the book of Samuel. We teeter-totter back on, well, do I put my trust in God, that God will bring, righteous judgment, or do I try and do it myself, right? And claim vengeance only for myself, right? And of course, that is the $1,000,000 question, right? And of course, the Christian answer is that, like, of course, ultimately, only God can be king. But with that being said, I think, as I keep spewing out that main theme, right, that only God can be king, it's one thing for me to say it to you. It's another thing to really think about that in contrast to a very real reflection of yourself. And I think Absalom, and this is why he's such a great character to study, is that Absalom is that perfect mirror for us to look at, like, if God were king or if I were king, how would things play out, right? And Absalom is the mirror for that. And reading Absalom's story here, should really show that to us, right? That, like, you know what? I have to trust in God, because if I were to do it myself, it would end up like this, right? And so, with that said, though, story, and we see that, like, this reflection, and I think Absalom brings this theme out the most. Like, sure, Saul and David had all these different things to talk about, but when I was talking about, like, contrasting David with God, as, like, David is king and God is king, or talk about Saul as king and God as king, right? It was more abstracto, and it's a lot more mental, of, like, how do I put it? It's more of, like, viewing ideals clashing, right? The ideals of men and the ideals of God clashing. That's how we read those stories. But when we read Absalom, it's not merely ideals, but rather the most real way of contrasting if God were king or if I were king or any human being, right? And I think that's the beauty that the Bible goes for here, of understanding this story and the story of Absalom, which we will now continue on. Actually, we're not going to continue chapter 14 yet, because I was talking so long about the beginning of the beginning of chapter 23. Or, wow, I'm all over the place today. I spent so long talking about, like, the beginning of the second half of chapter 13. I didn't even get to the rest of it, so we're gonna power through that quickly and then move on to chapter 14. So basically, Absalom comes up with this plan, right? And his plan is a pretty sound plan, right? He's like, all right, it's like sheep shearing season, so, like, late spring, I guess. And then he's like, yo, I'm gonna have a party at my place, right? Yo, we're gonna have a party at my place. Everybody come over, right? And then the king's just like, oh no, that wouldn't be right or whatever. And then Absalom's like, well, come on, at least let Amnon come, right? Aren't we family, right? Shouldn't families celebrate with each other, you know? And of course, Amnon tries to be sincere about this, right? Like, hey, we're family here. We should all hang out more often, right? Something easily relatable, especially considering everything that's been going on the last year and a bit. Families don't get to hang out as much as they like to. But Amnon's like, yo, family, let's hang out. But of course, Absalom is coming with this, like, brilliant plan, right? He's gonna have Amnon alone, and then he's gonna kill him, right? And of course, the poetic justice is that, like, he will have his way, quote unquote, with Amnon, like Amnon did to Tamar, right? So this is poetic justice that Absalom's thinking, right? Now, I know some people would bring up, like, what the heck, like, why did Amnon wait 2 years? Because that's the funny thing about how the story begins, right? Amnon waits 2 years, as verse 23 begins. He waits 2 years to extract his revenge. Although, to be fair, it makes sense that Absalom would have waited. Get those kids mixed up, right? It's what happens when you name all your kids the same thing. Oh, Absalom waits 2 years, right, to extract his revenge on Amnon. And of course it makes sense, right? I mean, think of it realistically, right? Like, let's say, let's put ourselves in Amnon or Absalom's shoes. Never put yourself in Amnon's shoes. Amnon's terrible. Put yourself in Absalom's shoes. I mean, Absalom's not the greatest guy either, but at least he's relatable. Let's put ourselves in Absalom's shoes, right? Something terrible happens to your family member. You're not going to call up, like, their offender and be like, hey, buddy, let's go get coffee next week, right? Like, that would put them on high alert, right? If, like, hey, man, let's go hang out next week. Even though, like, we are both aware of what you did to my sister. Let's hang out next week. Like, that would never fly, right? And Absalom's not an idiot, right? As a matter of fact, we find that Absalom's actually very intelligent. It's arguable that he's a tactician like his father, right? He's his father's son in that regard. But, Absalom, he bides his time. He's just like, well, if I call him right away, then, like, he'll know something's up, right? So let's wait a while. And 2 years does seem like a long time, right? Which, something else that let's be real, we can relate to this. Like, it can suck when you have to wait so long, right? Because you think of, like, Tamar is, like, imagine, let's put ourselves back in Absalom's shoes. Imagine your sister cries to you every day for 2 years because of, the fact that she was raped, and she cries to you for 2 years, right? Like, that's a very painful thing to live through, right? It's a very painful thing, and on the one hand, you're thinking, like, oh man, like, I can't keep going through this. I can't keep having my sister cry to me about, like, this pain she's going through. I've got to do something. But at the same time, on the other hand, you're thinking, like, if I'm gonna do something, I better make sure it works, right? I get one shot at this, right? I get one shot at revenge at Amnon, and so I have to think this through. I have to plan this out. So on the one hand, you want quick action, right? Because you don't want to see your family suffer. But on the other hand, you don't want to screw it up, right? Because you only get one shot at it. And that's kind of this funny thing that, like, yeah, the Bible kind of, like, it sounds weird that the Bible's like, yeah, 2 years later, Absalom finally decides to extract his revenge. But if you think about it realistically, it's like, yeah, it would take him that long. And you think about, like, in the world today where we want to bring justice or fight for a cause or something, right? And people think it's going to happen overnight. No, it never happens overnight, right? People know what's up, right? People are gonna catch on quick. No, you gotta plan it out slowly, right? You gotta plan out how things are gonna happen, right? Or else everything just gets sloppy, right? You can think of various movements that happens, right? People try to get quick action, quick results, and that gets sloppy, right? And then, of course, that discredits your movements, right? So there's that. But this is what you see when people are desperate for, like, we have to bring, like, change or whatever, right? But you have to plan it out. You have to think it through, and unfortunately, that's not what my generation is known for. So we could take a few notes from Absalom and learn to bide our time better if we're gonna try and usurp our older generation. Spoiler, that's what my generation is up to. Why lie about it? If you're honest about it, that's exactly what you're doing. But anyway, Absalom takes his time. Although the funny thing is that, like, the Bible's like 2 years it takes him to plan, and then, like, he goes through the plan and it seems pretty straightforward, right? Like, all right, everybody's here. We're gonna get Amnon alone here, and then we're just gonna stab him a bunch of times, right? Which is what Absalom's plan was, and that's basically what he does, right? And one thing that I find interesting in verse 28 is the language that's used. And I think this, once again, I think about the main theme of the book of Samuel, only God can be king kind of thing. It's interesting that the language that's used when Absalom is encouraging his men to kill Amnon, right? He uses this be strong, be courageous. Of course, that's a typical war cry thing, right? But of course, in the Bible, where else, who does those war cries in the Bible, right? It's always God who does it, right? God tells the Israelites, be strong, be courageous, be brave, right? And so here we have Absalom doing it with his men, that he says those kind of things to bolster his troops, or I guess his servants, to kill his brother, right? So moving on, we have Jonadab show up. This guy has got to be like the worst cousin in the history of bad cousins, right? So first of all, he was the one who like gives Amnon the idea so that Amnon, for Amnon and Tamar to be alone, right? And that's when Amnon takes advantage of her and rapes her. Jonadab came with that idea. Now we have Jonadab back here again, like talking about like reporting to the king that like, oh no, it's only Amnon that's dead because Absalom is extracting revenge, and he's kind of being like this demagogue character, right? He's just talking mad shit basically, right? And you got to be careful with people like Jonadab, right? All they do is just talk mad crap to stir up strife within the family. And the worst part is he's part of the family too, right? So like, what gives, right? He's like shattering his cousin's family, his uncle and his cousins, right? Like he's terrible. Like Jonadab is terrible. I just want to point out how terrible he is because he's a disgusting human being too. Then we get Absalom. Back to Absalom. He runs away. To be fair, anyone who would have committed murder would have ran away, right? So there's that. And then we get a report in verse 38 that Absalom moves away for 3 years and he lives somewhere far away from his dad, to try and avoid the wrath of, David. Which then makes something about David suspect, right? And this is where, once again, it's very reflective of like us millennials, if you will, versus the baby boomer generation, right? So the baby boomer generation, much like David, they do nothing when like, oh, this rape happened, and the older generation does nothing, right? But then if a young guy goes out and extracts his revenge, everybody's on him, right? Like, and so this is true in our society, and this is one reason why there's so much divide, right? Even on a political spectrum, right? There's this divide between like our generations, and it's stuff like this. And it's funny that the Bible, this is all the more reason why I think Second Samuel is so relevant, especially today. It's because like, yeah, like that's exactly what would happen today if something, if something like this happened today, it would play out exactly the same, right? And of course, like my generation would cry out about how terrible the older generation because of the fact they do nothing, right? And how complacent they are and how they protect the bad people, right? You think of like, oh, there was that one case. What was it like? It was back in 2019. Remember there was that case about that college student who raped a girl, and then people were trying to not get him expelled from school because they're like, well, if he gets uh, you know sentenced guilty for raping a person, you know, his college career would be gone, right? And so a lot of people in my generation was like, well, who cares, right? He did something wrong, he should pay. But then of course it's like this older justice system, quote unquote, that like, oh no, it's we're concerned about like what might happen to his future, you know? And then so it's like the older generation kind of like not taking a real stance. But then like no, like you charge a guy for doing evil. End of story, right? And so that's kind of what is the divide between David and Absalom, just like how it is with the older generation in the baby boomers versus millennials. It's interesting that, of course I'm going to keep bringing this up, but all the more reason. It's a case in point of why, like, yeah, studying Absalom is so important, especially for us today. So Absalom runs away for 3 years because now he's afraid that the older generation will punish him, right? And that's how a lot of people live today, right? They don't, and that's also like kind of what brings this problematic thing in my generation, because they're like, well, we want to do something, but we won't do it because the older generation, who's still in power for the most part, will just crack down on us, right? We can't bring real justice. We can't do this or that because the older generation favors the bad guys, right? And that's the easy reason why my generation is so frustrated with the older generation, right? You protect bad guys, quote unquote, more than you protect the rest of us. Of course, then, you run into other problems where, like, new bad people emerge from my generation, and then my generation ends up protecting them because we're so clouded in our judgment because we're thinking that we're God as opposed to trusting in God, right? And that's that's its own thing. And once again, that's the theme of the book of Samuel, right? Only God can be king, or else you just have everyone trying to be God, and well, when everyone else tries to be God, then bad things happen. That's kind of the rule of thumb, I guess, at this point, right, in human history. But that's just that's the way it played out back in David's time, and that's how it plays out today. All the more reason that, like, we need God to deliver us, right? We need Christ to deliver us from ourselves, because if left to our own devices, we're just gonna bring mayhem. We're good at that. We're good at mayhem, right? But I think that's what makes. No, I can't believe I've been like an hour and a half on one chapter. But like I said, chapter 13 had so much content, and then when we get to chapter 17, it'll be no different. But that's basically chapter 13, right? Absalom runs away because he's afraid of his father's wrath, which seems kind of ridiculous. Because where was David when Amnon raped Tamar, right? Where was David there? He wasn't doing anything. But when Absalom takes his revenge, well, then, like, David's all, well, at the very least, Absalom is all like, he thinks his dad's gonna be on his case, but then we read at the very end that David just wants to see Absalom again because he's his son. And this, of course, brings another problem with David, right? Because David, he thinks he's being a good dad by, like, wanting to protect his kids, but he ends up doing what's wrong in order to do that, right? David ends up compromising real justice, right? Because both Amnon and then Absalom, well, if Amnon was brought to justice earlier, then Absalom wouldn't have to do what he does, right? And that's kind of what we always wish, right? That real justice would be served so that we don't have to do it ourselves and be vigilantes, basically. Anyway, I've talked way too much about chapter 13, but once again, I mean, I don't want to do what I did with, like, Genesis 4, okay? I don't want to make, like, a whole stream on one chapter. So we're going to move on to chapter 14. However, if you guys do have comments and things you want to talk about chapter 13, we can always talk more about it in, like, one of my gaming streams. We can always talk more about it with us, right? And that's the thing I always try to encourage you guys on this channel. You can always talk about these kind of things. And if you have questions, just bring them to me, and we should talk about these things. They're important. They're important to talk about. But for now, I think I'm going to stop talking about chapter 13 because I have said a lot about it, even though there is so much more we can talk about. Chapter 14. So Joab, the son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart longed for Absalom. So Joab sent someone to Tekoa and had a wise woman brought from there. And he said to her, Pretend you are in mourning. Dress in mourning clothes, and don't use any cosmetic lotion. Act like a woman who has spent many days grieving for the dead. Then go to the king and speak these words to him. Sorry. And speak these words to him. And Joab put the words in her mouth. When the woman from Tekoa went to the king, she fell with her face to the ground to pay him honor. And she said, "Help me, your majesty." And the king asked, "What is troubling you?" She said, "I am a widow. My husband is dead. I, your servant, had 2 sons. They got into a fight with each other in the field, and no one was there to separate them. One struck the other and killed him. And the whole clan has risen up against your servant, and they say, 'Hand over the one who struck his brother down, so that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed. Then we will get rid of the heir as well.' They would put out only burning coal I have left, leaving my husband neither name nor descendant on the face of the earth." So the king said to the woman, "Go home, and I will issue an order in your behalf." But the woman from Tekoa said to him, "Let my lord the king pardon me and my family, and let the king and his throne be without guilt." Then the king replied, "If anyone says anything to you, bring them to me, and they will not bother you again." And she said, "Then let the king invoke the Lord his God to prevent the avenger of blood from adding to the destruction, so that my son will not be destroyed." "As surely as the Lord lives," the king said, "not one hair on your son's head will fall to the ground." Then the woman said, "Let your servant speak a word to my lord the king." "Speak." "Why have you devised a thing like this against the people of God? When the king says this, does he not convict himself that the king has not brought back his banished son? Like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be recovered, so we must die. But that is not what God desires. Rather, he devises ways so that a banished person does not remain banished from him." God, I can't believe I keep doing this voice. "And now I come to say this to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. Your servant, though, I will speak to the king. Perhaps he will grant his servant's request. Perhaps the king will agree to deliver his servant from the hand of the man who's trying to cut off both me and my son from God's inheritance." And now your servant says, "May the word of the Lord my king secure my inheritance. For my lord is the king is like an angel in discerning good and evil. May the Lord your God be with you." And the king said to the woman, Don't keep from me the answer to what I am going to ask you." "Let my lord the king speak." And the king asked, "Isn't the hand of Joab with you in all this?" And the woman answered, "As surely as you live, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right or to the left from anything my lord the king says. For yes, it was Joab who instructed me to do this, and to put all these words into the mouth of your servant. Your servant Joab did this to change the present situation. My lord has wisdom like that of an angel of God. He knows everything, what happens in the land." The king said to Joab, "Very well, I will go do it. Go, bring back the young man Absalom." So Joab fell with his face to the ground to pay honor to him. And he blessed the king. And Joab said, "Today your servant knows that he has found favor in your eyes, my lord the king, because the king has granted his servant's request." Then Joab went to Geshur. And then Joab went to Geshur and brought Absalom back to Jerusalem. But the king said, "He must go to his own house. He must not see my face." So Absalom went to his own house and did not see the face of the king. In all Israel there is not a man so highly praised in his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the top of his head to the sole of his foot, there was no blemish in him. Whenever he cut the hair of his head, he used to cut his hair once a year, because it became too heavy for him. He would weigh it, and his weight was 200 shekels by royal standard. 3 sons and a daughter were born to Absalom. His daughter's name was Tamar, and she became a beautiful woman. Absalom lived 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing the king's face. Then Absalom sent for Joab in order to send him to the king, but Joab refused to come to him. So he sent a second time, but Joab still refused. Then Absalom said to his servants, Look, Joab's field is next to mine, and he's barely even there. Go, set it on fire." So Absalom's servants set the field on fire. Then Joab did go to Absalom's house and said to him, "Why have your servants set my field on fire?" And so Absalom said to Joab, "Look, I sent word to you and said, 'Come here, so I can send you to the king and ask, why have I come from Geshur? It would have been better for me if I were still there. Now then, I want to see the king's face, and if I am guilty of anything, let him put me to death." So Joab went to the king and told him this. And the king summoned Absalom, and he came in, bowed his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. Alright, so chapter 14. We're past most of the Jerry Springer level of stuff, so I'll probably power through this part pretty quickly. So Absalom, he's been gone for a while, and Joab, one of the servants. And one thing that's kind of interesting about this is that the Bible never really tells us why Joab thinks this is a good idea, or why Joab wants to even do this, right? Like, why would Joab want to bring Absalom back? It's not like Absalom is his kid or anything. And then the Bible doesn't tell us if, like, Joab is Absalom's, like, uncle or something, right? So we don't really know why Joab thinks that, like, oh yeah, the king should bring back Absalom. The only answer I can give is a much more, like, how do I put this? It's the modern Christian answer, right? So it may not be an adequate answer if we're looking at, like, the Old Testament, but I'm going to use it anyway. And that's perhaps, Joab's thinking, like, we should be more God honoring and be able to forgive people, right? I think we should forgive as opposed to being harsh with Absalom. Because, I think we can see Absalom's perspective, and, justice has been served in some regard to the raping of Tamar. So you know what? We can be forgiving toward Absalom. Of course, that's a more Christian answer that maybe Joab was thinking of, like, why to bring Absalom back, to forgive him. Because once again, Absalom points it out, and rightly so, like, why bother bringing me back, right? And there's this thing where, like, excuse me, this is where, like, once again, this kind of shows David as not being the best dad here, right? So Absalom's been gone for, like, 3 years already. And so David decides, like, you know what, Joab, sure, we'll bring Absalom back. But then David doesn't even go bother seeing the guy, right? David doesn't even bother seeing Absalom. And of course, Absalom, rightfully so, gets frustrated with this, right? If, let's say, your parents call you to do something, you expect them to call you for a reason, right? Just say, oh, come here, and then, like, nothing, right? And so Absalom kind of feels that frustration, like, well, why'd you bother calling me here, right? And so, well, Absalom's frustration with his dad is somewhat legitimized, like, don't waste my time. Don't just call me here if you're not going to do anything, right? He gets frustrated as any normal person would. But then, once again, Absalom starts taking extreme measures. And of course, we use extremes in stories to kind of show the nuances of like how desperate people can be at times. Because I know most people would think like, well, I wouldn't go light my neighbor's field on fire if I wanted something from like, I wanted something from someone. I wouldn't just go light someone's field on fire. But of course, that's where those minor sociopathic elements of Absalom's character start, showing up. They kind of show that like, Absalom could be a very dark character. And we saw this with David too, right? Where David would be, a little too bloodthirsty. Excuse me. Wow, I'm yawning a lot now. That's because I probably exhausted myself by doing chapter 13. But, David had his like little hints of a darker nature, right? Where like he's bloodthirsty and whatever. And that ends up coming to bite him. In the same way, Absalom's having these kind of sociopathic moments, right? It's like, you know what? I'm frustrated. You know what my solution to my frustration is? Committing arson. And so, yeah, like that sounds like a great plan, right? So he commits arson. And I like how Joab's like, what the heck, man? Like, why'd you light my field on fire? As any normal person would react to their stuff getting lit on fire. Joab's like, yo, what the heck, man? And Absalom's like, I've been here for like 2 years. Like, am I gonna see my dad or what? And that, when you put it like that, like, this just begging the question, like, how good David's parentage is, right? Because, he's got this estranged son here he needs to deal with, right? And the funny thing is, and this is what makes Absalom, like, he's relatable, and he doesn't seem like he's all a bad guy, even though he is, like, the villain of his own story. He doesn't seem like a bad guy because, like, Absalom seems like he's ready to own up. He's like, yo, look, man, if killing Amnon was wrong, I'm prepared to face the consequence. I'm prepared for the death sentence. I did what I thought was right, and I'm ready to face the consequences, right? And that's something that, like, yeah, most of us would be like, that's an admirable quality, being able to, like, if I did something wrong, then punish me for it. I can take it. And so, this also adds to like Absalom not seeming like such a bad guy, right? Because he's ready to own up to his own crime, and it's like if it's the death sentence, I'll take it, right? I'll take my death sentence like a man, right? And that's kind of what makes Absalom an interesting character study, right? Because he does show these admirable qualities, and that's something that like you think of people in my own generation. We tend to think we want to show admirable qualities even when we take the extremes we do, right? But of course, the twist of the story is when David sees Absalom, he's just like happy to see him, right? He's so happy to see him. And he even like gives him a kiss and all that, right? He's really happy to see him. Okay, so I want to talk about something kind of funny in chapter 14. And the Bible kind of like paints this like, oh, something's gonna go down, right? You're like, let's be real. We know something's gonna go down. I already spoiled it for you. Something's gonna go down. But like, I like how the Bible's kind of like talk about how great Absalom is. And of course, there's this like, the repeating pattern, right? Like, he's got a great start, but we'll see if he ends well. Spoiler, not really. But like, we talk about Absalom and some of his like, good things about him. Of course, the funny thing is that the Bible is like I think the first thing is his looks, doesn't it? Doesn't it bring up his looks first, or? Yeah, it brings up his looks first, right? So Absalom's like super good looking. And I like how the Bible's like, he had like the most wicked ass hair, right? Like, he would cut his hair once a year and people would weigh it. And it was like, people like thought it was awesome that he, like his hair, he had great hair, right? And then like, he's so good looking, right? Like, Absalom. And there's all those things where like, I guess all David's kids must have been good looking. I mean, there's one reason why Absalom would lust, or sorry, Amnon would lust over his half sister, right? Because I guess all of them are good looking, and Absalom's good looking too. So it's safe to reason that Absalom and Tamar, who are full siblings, right? If Absalom's super good looking, I assume Tamar is also super good looking. So, I mean, I guess it makes sense why Amnon would lust over her. And there's of course the whole like mythological thing about like Jewish women being super hot. Um, I mean, the Bible does this on multiple occasions, right? Like, there's a whole joke of like Sarah, Abraham's wife, all the way back in Genesis. Like, she was viewed as super hot, despite the fact she was like 70. So there's that, right? And then of course there's the Book of Esther, who's like picked out one out of like 1,000 women to be like the king's bride, and she's the hottest one, so she gets picked, right? And then stuff like that, right? And so there's just this like mythological element used in the Bible about how beautiful Jewish women were. And then of course, I guess a super hot Jewish woman would have a pretty good looking brother as well. So Absalom gets to be good looking. Oh, the world isn't fair. Oh, but Absalom apparently is super good looking. And then we get this moment where like the Bible tells us this tidbit about Absalom, which makes him seem like a really great guy, right? He's not a bad guy. Sure, he committed murder, but he's really not that bad a guy. He's a great guy, isn't he? Because he has a daughter and he names her after his sister, right? Because he unlike that asshat Amnon, actually loves his sister, and his sister, who's now been disgraced and probably will never have kids, and will probably end up being a angry cat lady. He has a kid in her honor, right? Absalom has a kid in his sister's honor, and names his daughter Tamar. Like, how is Absalom not a great guy, right? And just like how we look at people in our own generation that may not be the best people, but they do these honorable things, and how are they bad people, right? And that's the great thing about reading about Absalom too. It's like, yeah, like you would we would do similar things too, right? And to promote our own sense of justice and whatever, right? And that's kind of what the story's getting at, is that Absalom's painting this picture of like, I'm so great, aren't I? Like, I got justice for my sister, and I honor my sister, right? Like, I care about women, especially back then, right? That would have been a bold statement, right? And then like, we see guys like him today, right? There's a lot of guys like him today. But then of course, they also would commit other atrocities. But oh no, we do things in honor of these people that have been hurt. But we will commit atrocities ourselves. Which, if I say any names, I might get in trouble. So I think I'm going to leave that alone. But you know what I'm talking about. But all the more reason to study Absalom, because like, yeah, just like these people that we find in the 21st century doing atrocities, but also claiming that it's honorable. Absalom is like, yeah, I commit atrocities, but I'm an honorable person, right? Like, come on. And I'm good looking too, like long, sexy, flowing hair. Right? I wish I had that because I clearly don't. My hair growing ability sucks. Like, if it grows out, it's like this like coarse mop on my head, right? Because I don't have fine hair, so it's harder to grow out more. Or rather, see, the funny thing about hair, I guess we're gonna talk about it. talk about hair. You know, if you have like finer hair, sure you get split ends easier, but it's easier to grow it as well because like it doesn't take as much maintenance to do, right? Whereas coarser hair, you don't get like some of those problems with like split ends and whatever, and you know your hair is more. You're not likely to bald as early if you have coarser hair. But at the same time, it's harder to grow out because then like it's so much maintenance that's really not worth it. But I guess Absalom's one of those people who gets to have great hair. I'm not one of them. Oof! So I guess I'm not as relatable to Absalom as I thought I was, but oh well. I guess not all of us can have great hair. But I find that part about like Absalom being like an honorable guy kind of funny, right? Because, you know, this is the same guy who commits murder, so there's that. But don't worry, it's all for the right reasons, right? We can do bad things if we do it for the right reasons. Sound familiar? I hope it does. But once again, all the more reason to study Absalom and why he's a really great character to study. Alright, we're going to read one more chapter. Chapter 15. And use chapter 15 as more of a setup chapter, right? Because I didn't want to just read the 2 chapters. But chapter 15 will lead on to chapter 16. Because, of course, you know, there's a whole crazy thing that's going to happen, right? Basically, we're going to go back to the Jerry Springer stuff. Lovely, right? But that will be next week when we continue on in chapter 16. But we're going to read chapter 15 and end the stream on that one. Dang, I'm out of ginger ale. Out of soda. Oh well. Chapter 15. Now in the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses, and with 50 men to run ahead of him. He would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" And the person would answer, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." And Absalom would add, "Oh, if only I were appointed judge in the land. Then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to meet me, and I would see that they receive justice." Also, whenever anyone approached to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. Absalom behaved in this way toward all the Israelites who came to the king asking for justice. And so, he stole the hearts of the people. Now at the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Let me go to Hebron to fulfill a vow I made to the Lord. While your servant was living at Geshur in Aram, I made this vow. If the Lord takes me back to Jerusalem, I will worship the Lord in Hebron." So the king said to him, "Go in peace." So Absalom went to Hebron. Then Absalom sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel to say, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, 'Absalom is the king in Hebron.'" 200 men from Jerusalem had accompanied Absalom. They had been invited as guests and went quite innocently, knowing nothing of the matter. While Absalom was offering sacrifices, he also sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, to come from Gilo, his hometown. And so the conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following kept increasing. Now a messenger came and told David, "The hearts of the people are with Absalom." Then David said to all his officials, who were with him in Jerusalem, "Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin on us and put the city to the sword." The king's officials answered him, "Your servants are ready to do our lord the king chooses." The king set out, and his entire household followed him, but he left 10 concubines to take care of the palace. So the king set out with all the people following him, and they halted at the edge of the city. All of his men marched past them along with the Gerathites, and the Pelethites, and all the 600 Gittites who had accompanied him from Gath marched before the king. So the king said to Ittai the Gittite, "Why should you come along with us? Go back and stay with King Absalom, for you are a foreigner, an exile from your homeland. You came only yesterday, and today shall I make you wander about with us, when I do not know where I am going? Go back and take your people with you, and may the Lord show you kindness and faithfulness." But Ittai replied to the king, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as my lord the Gittite lives, wherever my lord the king may be, wherever it means life or death, there will your servant be also." So David said to Ittai, "Go ahead, march on." So Ittai the Gittite marched on with all his men and the families that were with him. The whole country wept aloud as all the people passed by. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley, and all the people moved on toward the wilderness. Now Zadok was there too, and all the Levites who were with him were carrying the ark of the Lord. And they set down the ark of God, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until all the people had finished leaving the city. Then the king said to Zadok, "Take the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again. But if he says, 'I am not pleased with you,' then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him." So the king also said to Zadok the priest, "Do you understand? Go back to the city with my blessing. Take your son Ahimaaz, yes, that's how you say that, Ahimaaz, with you, and also Abiathar's son, Jonathan. You and Abiathar return with your 2 sons. I will wait at the fords in the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me." So Zadok and Abiathar took the ark of God back to Jerusalem, and they stayed there. But David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered, and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too, and were weeping as they went up. Now David had been told, "Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom." So David prayed, "Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness." When David arrived at the summit, where people used to worship God, Hushai the Archite was there to meet him, his robe torn and dust on his head. And David said to him, "If you go with me, you will be a burden unto me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, 'Your Majesty, I will bring your servant. I was your father's servant in the past, but now I will be your servant,' then you can help me by frustrating Ahithophel's advice. Won't the priests Zadok and Abiathar be there with you? Tell them anything you hear in the king's palace. Their 2 sons, Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, and Jonathan, son of Abiathar, are there with them. Send them to me with anything you hear. So Hushai, David's confidant, arrived at Jerusalem as Absalom was entering the city. Alright, so chapter 15. I'm not going to talk too much about it. One, because I'm tired for some, as you can notice, I'm fading. But anyway, in chapter 15, I mean, a lot of it was, I already talked about this kind of stuff in chapter 13, you know, like more things of Absalom that make him relatable, right? So the big thing in chapter 15 is that Absalom comes up with this plan to usurp his father of the throne. And so Absalom, he's like, every day he goes in front of the town gate and he just like meets people and he talks to them and he's like, hey, you know, I'll hear your case and everything, right? And then of course he says, if I were king, I would give you all justice. And you know, the funny thing is that like this is also something that makes him like really relatable, especially like in my generation, he's the perfect mirror. But like you see a lot of the stuff that goes on today, right? Political movements and you know, stuff like that. A lot of people sound like Absalom today, right? If only I were in charge, right? Then I would make sure justice was served, right? And you know, that's kind of the statement of my generation, you know, of our generation would be like, well, if we were in charge instead of them boomers, right? Stuff would get done. You hear that a lot, right? It's like if we were in charge, justice would be served. If we were in charge, things would be better, right? And so there's this kind of mindset of like, well, I know what's best, and you know, who cares about the old guys? Because all the old guys care about their own interests, right? But I know what's best. I will do things for the people, right? Quote unquote, the people. And so, you know, Absalom is really relatable here, right? Because you know he's the modern person, right? Whereas David is a representation of that outdated past. And you know, it's relevant not just in our generation; it's relevant in every generation because every generation thinks that, right? They think that they will be the ones who will, you know, do what's right, and everyone preceding them is clearly wrong, right? Because you know, us millennials will get old, and there'll be a generation after us, and they're gonna say the same thing, right? They're gonna say like, oh, you know, them old guys, those millennials, they don't know anything. They're too self-serving and only cared about themselves. Well, if we were in charge, then things would get better, right? And every generation likes to make that claim about themselves because every generation wants to think that they are the best generation. So Absalom, you know, when he talks like this, it's like, yeah, you know, that makes sense. And it's very, very ordinary and very human for him to act that way, you know, in all the bad ways too. But I find that like this just adds on to like Absalom sounds a lot like my generation, right? Of course, I'm included as part of the problem. I wouldn't say that like, you know, I'm not saying that the rest of you are this terrible and I'm not, right? Because I too have been guilty of some of this stuff, right? Because I mean, it's all the more case in point of that he is the mirror of this generation. And that's kind of why I think he's such a fascinating person to read about. Of course, you know, many people, they may try and deny and be like, well, we wouldn't do what Absalom does, but I love how chapter 15 plays out where like Absalom, because of this like huge conspiracy, right? And so he's going to go to Hebron and excuse me, he already has it planned out that like when he gets to Hebron, he's gonna have the people, he's gonna rile up the people and make the people elect him as king, right? And say like Absalom is king, right? Long live the king, Absalom. And so Absalom's hoping to use that to like leverage against his dad and to say like, well, I'm better than you'll ever be, right? And to basically throw him out. Sound familiar? It shouldn't. It should, right? Because I mean that's kind of what the, you know, what the millennials are basically doing to the boomers. Right? That's kind of what's going on. It's just like, well, we'll usurp you, and then we'll do everything right because we know what we're doing, right? We'll bring justice for everyone, and we'll see where that gets him. Of course, the story does transition to David, right? Because remember, David is the main character. He's the second. He's the king in the Tale of Two Kings, right? He's the second one there in First and Second Samuel. He's the tale of the second king, so I guess we gotta keep talking about the second king, right? And so, I'm fading fast here, so I gotta speed this up. He's like, yeah, David's like, we gotta get out of here, because, Absalom's serious. He's gonna try and overthrow me, and so he runs off and he takes his family with him. But then, of course, there's the foreshadowing moment, if you guys remember from a few chapters ago. I'm not going to give it away quite yet because, once again, promoting, go watch the other stream. But basically, it's good. There's an old saying, right? One often meets their fate on the road they take to avoid it. And so let's just say David is going to learn that in a not so fun way. So if you guys want to tune in for that, that will be next Friday at 3 o'clock Pacific time. I really gotta find a way to get more sleep time in before doing these, because I always find myself tired halfway through these streams. And you think you think playing a video game would take more brain power, but actually not. Right, the opposite is true. And also because I'm talking the whole time here, right? So it takes a lot of oxygen out of your brain, and that's probably why I yawn so much. But with that being said, I'm going to hold out on talking more about Chapter 15 because, of course, a lot of things will become more relevant when Chapter 16 comes around. And boy, howdy, Chapter 16 and 17 is going to be a lot. So I might even do a stream with just those two chapters, honestly, because it's going to get nuts, right? But with that said, you don't want to miss next week's reading stream as I continue through 2 Samuel, starting with chapter 16. You don't want to miss it. And so, with that said, though, this is going to be the end of the stream. Just do a bit of housekeeping. So, next week, we have Mario and Rabbids. I'm still playing through the Donkey Kong DLC on Monday. If I somehow finish it, which I probably won't in one day, then we'll find something to do on Wednesday. Otherwise, I think Wednesday will also be Donkey Kong DLC. I think it'll take me 3 streams to do it. Then, of course, keep your eyes peeled for the next Throwback Thursday episode. Spoiler alert, I will be, as I mentioned in that last video that I uploaded yesterday for Throwback Thursday, it's gonna be a longer video next week because I am finishing the final part of the map and just beat the map basically. And so instead of separating that into 2 videos and the second half being super short and boring, I just made a 50-minute video as opposed to a half an hour and then a 20-minute video, right? So that's gonna be how it looks like for next week. So quick rundown: Mario Rabbids Monday, Wednesday at 3 o'clock Pacific time. And then Thursday will be Throwback Thursday, Heroes of Might and Magic 2, The Price of Loyalty. And then finally next Friday, you don't want to miss it, with 2 Samuel chapter 16 and 17, and maybe 18, but probably not because those other chapters are going to be so heavy, if you will. Oh, it's going to be a grand old time next week, so I really hope you guys come for that. Also, if you guys have questions about these set of chapters, and I encourage you guys to send them because, these chapters, chapter 13, 14, 15 that we just read, there's just so much to talk about, right? If I wasn't half falling asleep now, I would keep going. I could keep talking about them, and I think Absalom is such a great character to study, right? I think talking about him is very helpful and educational, and so I'm definitely down to talk more about that if you guys are interested. So, don't miss next Friday, 3 o'clock, for the continuation of Absalom's story. starting from chapter 16. But with that said, hope you guys have a great rest of your day. I hope you guys have a great long weekend. You know, us BC locals. Of course, that depends if people might boycott this weekend, because you know it's a Canadian-based holiday. So there's that. I kind of already see it coming, and the reason why I have to, you know, I'm being more vocal about this is, you know, I know it's a funny story. Um, maybe this is not you, and if it is you, I don't know what to say about this, but I did get some PM shits because I celebrated Canada Day with the Canada Day stream. I got some shit from people about, oh, you know, you shouldn't be celebrating Canada Day, and especially not with a stream. Yeah. So if that's you, I don't know what to say about that, but you know, to other people in my view count, you know, I'm still gonna stream on BC Day, and I'm gonna wish you, you know, have a fun long weekend, right? Because long weekends are awesome. So with that said, though, I hope you guys have a great rest of your Friday night. I hope you guys have a great long weekend for the people in BC, and I'll see you guys next time. God bless you.